On my 20th birthday, my mom threw cold water on my face and said, "Time to grow up and move out." I woke up to find my stepdad standing beside my belongings stacked at the door. They had always been harsh, but I never imagined this. "But I'm your son," I said. My mom simply stared. My stepdad nodded. "You've been a burden since your dad died, using our money on therapy and complaining about nightmares. We gave you food and a place to stay for 20 years. That's more than most would offer." They shoved my things into my arms and pushed me outside before I fully understood what was happening. I didn't fight. Part of me felt numb. After hours of wandering, clearing my head and petting stray cats, I ended up at a city homeless shelter. I trembled while filling out the intake forms. My phone buzzed. My parents had unblocked me just to add more pain. My stepfather wrote, "At least your dad had the decency to die in Afghanistan," followed by a facepalm emoji. I broke down in that plastic chair. A tired counselor placed a hand on my shoulder. "Honey, what's going on?" she asked. I showed her the messages. As she read them, she glanced between my form and my face. She suddenly froze. "Wait, Jackson Brooks, your father died in Afghanistan?" "Yeah, when I was 7. She gripped her desk. "Did you ever see his body? Were you at the funeral?" "No, why are you asking me this?" She quickly typed on her Chromebook. After a minute, her face went pale. "Liam, your father didn't die in Afghanistan." My chest tightened. "What?" "He's alive. He's in Palmer V, a psychiatric unit. He's been there forever." The lights felt too bright. "That's not possible. We had a funeral. I went to grief counseling." She looked directly at me. "You need to go see him today, before your parents find out you know the truth." Suddenly, small memories made sense. My mom avoiding military families on TV, our sudden move after the funeral. I wanted to cry, but my stepdad's words about being a man echoed in my mind. "Why today?" I asked. "Because once your parents realize you know he's alive, they'll understand someone is looking into their benefits." She drove me to the VA facility. The entire ride, my mind rejected what I had learned. Inside the hospital, we walked through a long hallway, smelling like disinfectant and medication. My father was there. Not the stepdad who hit me, not my mom's boyfriends who drifted in and out, but my real father. "Dad?" I whispered. He turned and his face fell apart. "Liam, they told me you never wanted to see me, that you hated me. I thought you were gone. I went to your funeral. Mom said you died a hero." He winced. "They told me you knew I was here and chose them instead." My phone buzzed. A notification showed my parents had emptied my college fund, birthday savings, everything. The account was closed. Dad looked at the screen after I dropped the phone. "All my combat pay went to you," he whispered. "Every month for 10 years. It was for your future." I never saw any of it. A doctor walked in. "Mr. Brooks has been medically ready for discharge for years, but due to his disability, he needs a family member willing to take responsibility." "I'll do it," I said instantly. "I'll take care of him." The next morning felt unreal. Dad walked out wearing simple clothes, pants, and a loose flannel. His breath grew unsteady as we approached my mother's house. 10 years, he whispered. 10 years stolen from us. We reached the same door where they forced me out the day before. The deadbolt clicked. My stepdad opened the door. His expression collapsed. My mom stepped behind him, dropping her coffee mug. Dad smiled slightly. "Hello, David. We need to talk about my death benefits." David's face shifted repeatedly. Mom's mug shattered across the floor, coffee spreading over the tile. The breaking sound felt symbolic, like the lies were cracking with it. David shouted that we couldn't simply show up, accusing us of trespassing and making false claims. His voice climbed louder. Mom quickly shifted tactics, acting concerned. She asked if Dad was taking his medication, speaking to him as if he were confused. Without planning it, I reached into my pocket and opened my camera app, holding the phone low but angled to record everything. David noticed after 30 seconds and stepped forward, hand out, trying to grab my phone. Dad moved between us, his hands shaking. David hesitated when he noticed a neighbor across the street retrieving mail. He stepped back. Mom then suggested calmly that we come inside to talk. Dad's breathing changed, fast and shallow. I recognized the look from the hospital. He was fading. I touched his arm and told him we were leaving. He nodded silently. We walked back to the car. Dad still trembled as I helped him into the passenger seat. I remembered the counselor's direct number and called her. I quickly explained what happened. She gave us a one-night emergency voucher and the address of a motel. Dad stared at his shaking hands the entire drive. The room smelled of old cigarettes and cleaning spray. 2 worn mattresses, a scratched desk, and faded curtains greeted us. I laid everything out on the desk: Dad's discharge papers, my birth certificate, screenshots of texts, the bank notifications. Organizing them helped me feel less overwhelmed. I photographed every item, then called the bank. After a 10-minute hold, someone finally answered. My college savings account had been closed the previous morning. All the money transferred to an account I wasn't authorized to access. They suggested filing a police report, but warned I'd need proof that the funds were mine. I admitted quietly that I had nowhere to live. She sympathized, but said documentation was required. She gave me a case number. I wrote it down with shaking hands. Dad finally spoke. When he enlisted, he set up payments to support our family in case something happened. He didn't understand every detail, but trusted the system. He thought I had been receiving support for college all along. I told him I never saw any of it. He covered his face with his hands, and it broke something in me. This man had been locked away for a decade and lost everything, including his son. He carried guilt for things he tried to make right. I sat with him until he calmed. Then I backed up everything on my phone to the cloud for an hour. The counselor had stressed that documenting everything was essential when dealing with people who had more resources. I created an evidence folder, saved every screenshot, every recording, every document, and backed it up in 3 places: my phone, Google Drive, and an email draft. If anything happened to my device, the files would survive. That brought a small sense of security. The next morning, we returned to Palmer. Dad needed updated ID information and copies of his benefits history. The discharge coordinator, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses, was efficient but slow, typing with 2 fingers. Dad signed multiple forms, and she estimated his new ID would take 3 weeks. The benefits history would be ready that afternoon. I waited patiently, even though my mind screamed that every day gave my mom and stepdad more time to hide money or delete documents. After the paperwork, Dad said he was exhausted, so I drove us back to the motel. He fell asleep almost instantly. I looked at the arranged documents. We had taken our first steps. We were gathering evidence and reclaiming his identity. It wasn't enough yet, but it was something. More than I had 3 days ago when cold water hit my face at dawn. The next morning, I called the VA benefits number. After being transferred 4 times, I ended up on hold with old elevator music. 50 minutes passed while I organized papers. Finally, someone answered and asked for Dad's SSN. I about representative payees and power of attorney, but stumbled over the terminology. The woman patiently explained that a representative payee manages benefits for someone unable to do so. They must be approved by the VA. Someone had been receiving Dad's benefits under that arrangement for years. I asked who. She said she couldn't share that without authorization. I wrote everything down on the motel notepad, my handwriting shaky. She explained how to change a representative payee and that Dad would need an evaluation. After an hour, I had pages of notes and still barely understood half of it. I updated the shelter counselor about the VA phone call. She suggested connecting me with Adult Protective Services because my parents might have financially exploited a disabled veteran. I hesitated. My mother had spent years telling me that government agencies caused more trouble and made situations worse. The counselor must have heard my hesitation, because she said the system can be the only protection people have. I thought about how the system was the one that located Dad before I even knew where to look. With no home or money, I couldn't take on Mom and David alone. I agreed. She gave me a contact and said to call a man named Lucas Gray, someone experienced with cases like ours. I wrote down the details and thanked her. Before calling him, I tried something else. I searched for family numbers buried in my contacts, relatives from before we moved states. Most were disconnected. I left 3 voicemails explaining what happened and asking if they were willing to speak with me. None responded. I tried my mother's sister, Aunt Lisa. She answered on the 4th ring. She cut me off as I introduced myself. She claimed my mother told her I was lying to make them look bad and refused to get involved in family drama. I told her Dad was alive, but she interrupted again. She said I should be grateful instead of stirring up trouble because Mom raised me alone after losing her husband. Then she hung up. I stared at my phone. It became clear Mom had isolated herself from anyone who might challenge her story or support me if I learned the truth. After Dad went to sleep, I opened a new document on my phone and wrote down every detail I remembered. I started with Dad's supposed death at age 7. Then I listed everything afterward. Our move to another state within months of the funeral. Mom panicking whenever military families appeared on TV. Her changing the subject whenever I asked about Dad's service or wanted to see photos. How she threw out most of his belongings during the move, saying it hurt too much. How we never visited a gravesite. I wrote about therapy sessions where I cried about losing him, about the nightmares that lasted for years. Mom had used my grief to control me and make me feel guilty for expressing sadness. Writing it all out revealed patterns, layers of lies. A carefully constructed narrative built over a decade to keep me from asking the right questions. My phone lit up around midnight. A text from Mom. She said we could talk if I stopped spreading stories and making her look bad in front of neighbors. People asking questions embarrassed her. She said I was being emotional, and we could settle things if I calmed down and came home. I read it 3 times. I stared at the reply box for nearly half an hour. Part of me wanted to type everything I felt, but I knew that was what she wanted, something she could twist and use to confuse me again. Instead, I took a screenshot. I uploaded it to my evidence folder. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and didn't respond. The next morning, Dad ate the free motel breakfast I brought back. I told him we needed to talk about boundaries and safety. He looked up like he expected bad news. I explained that Mom and David might try to call him and that he couldn't share where we were staying or what we were doing. He nodded, but didn't speak. I continued. They might try to convince him I was lying or had abandoned him. I told him he couldn't tell them anything, no matter what. He agreed, but his eyes showed fear, the same fear I saw at Palmer when he thought I might leave him. I rested my hand on his arm across the small table and assured him I wasn't going anywhere. We were handling this together. He relaxed and kept eating. That afternoon, I went to my legal aid appointment. The office was in a strip mall next to a tax service. Inside smelled like old coffee and copy machine toner. After filling out intake paperwork, the receptionist led us to a small office where Sophia Williams waited. She appeared around 30, with glasses and dark hair pulled back. She shook our hands and asked us to sit. She opened a yellow legal pad and asked us to start. I told her everything, waking up to cold water on my birthday, the shelter counselor finding Dad, the confrontation on Mom's porch, and the drained accounts. She took clear notes without interrupting. When I finished, she looked up and said we might have claims for fraud and conversion, legal terms for lying to take money and property. She added that the district attorney might see criminal components. She asked for evidence, so I handed her my phone with photos and recordings. She said saving everything was smart. It would take time, she said, but she would help us. 3 days later, I received a call from a private number. The caller introduced himself as Lucas Gray from Adult Protective Services. He wanted to schedule a phone intake since the shelter counselor had referred the case. I grabbed my notebook and answered his questions about Dad's situation. He said he would open a case and assign an investigator. He explained it would take time because they needed to interview multiple people and gather financial records. I felt impatient. I wanted answers immediately. I wanted Mom and David held accountable now. Lucas maintained a steady tone. A thorough investigation, he said, was better than a rushed one. I knew he was right even though I didn't like hearing it. He said an investigator would call in about a week to schedule interviews and told me to keep documenting everything. Next, the bank contacted me. Isabel Stone from the fraud department said she had opened a case after my initial report. She listed the documents I needed: a police report, identification, proof the account was meant for me, and any evidence showing my parents didn't have my permission. I wrote everything down, but each requirement felt overwhelming. I didn't have some of the documents and didn't know how to get the rest. Isabel must have sensed my frustration because she advised taking it one step at a time. She gave me her direct number and said she would be my case agent. Later that afternoon, Victor Hall from the VA called. He scheduled a consultation for housing and caregiver programs. He also suggested changing Dad's representative payee. He mentioned programs like HUD-VASH, caregiver stipends, and aid and attendance, terms I didn't recognize. I took notes as quickly as I could, but he was talking fast and I kept losing track. He slowed down once he realized and said he would send everything by email. He asked when we could meet in person. I felt some relief when I looked over and saw Dad watching TV on the bed. Having someone who understood the system made the uncertainty feel a little less overwhelming. Our appointment was set for the following week. When I hung up, my hands stopped shaking. The next morning, Elena Carter at Legal Aid helped me draft a formal request to Peaceful Rest Funeral Home. I gave her the name and location of the service Mom took me to 12 years ago. Elena said we needed official confirmation of what services were provided. She typed the request on Legal Aid letterhead, and I signed it. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the motel. Dad watched from the bed as I opened it. The funeral home director wrote that they provided a memorial chapel rental on that date, but no remains were delivered for burial or cremation. Their records showed only a 2-hour chapel booking, no casket order, no burial plot, no cremation authorization. Reading it made me feel sick. I already knew Dad wasn't dead, but seeing proof that the funeral was empty made it real in a new and unsettling way. That afternoon, I went to the downtown police station to file a report. A front desk officer guided me to Detective Hugo Larkin. He looked to be in his 50s, with gray hair and glasses. I sat across from his desk as he opened a form on his computer. I told him everything. Waking up to cold water on my birthday, discovering Dad alive at Palmer, the drained accounts, and a decade of stolen benefits. He typed continuously as I talked. When I finished, he printed the report and had me review it. He said it would take time to investigate. Cases involving multiple parties and government benefits were complex, but the report number would help with the bank and other agencies. He gave me a business card and told me to call if I remembered anything or if my parents contacted me. I folded the report and added it to my evidence folder. 3 days later, I was sorting documents on the hotel bed when I noticed David's car parked 3 spaces down. He was sitting inside, watching our room. My entire body went cold. I immediately called 911. I threw our things into bags, struggling to zip them because my hands shook. Dad asked what was happening, and I pointed out the window. His face went pale. The dispatcher stayed on the line as we packed. She said officers were about 7 minutes away. David stayed parked, watching. He didn't move. When the police arrived, he slowly drove off. They took another report and told me to record any future contact. After they left, I sat on the floor with my back against the bed. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. From now on, he said, we would keep our bags packed, just in case. The next day, Elena helped me request my old school district counseling records. She said we needed proof of years of treatment related to Dad's supposed death. A week later, I spread the documents across the motel desk. Pages of counseling notes, from ages 7 to 16, each labeled with the diagnostic code for parent loss. My therapist documented my long-term grief, the nightmares, and my struggles with Dad's death. The notes also showed how Mom told the therapist I needed help processing a wartime loss. Insurance was billed for every session under that same code. Reading years of my pain in clinical terms felt like reading about someone else. Yet it also showed how long Mom and David maintained the lie. The next week, Elena sent formal preservation letters to the bank and my parents. Address. The letters required that no financial records related to Dad's benefits or my accounts be destroyed. She said this was standard before filing a lawsuit. Destroying evidence after receiving such a notice could lead to additional penalties. She believed the formal language carried weight. It felt different reading the letter before she mailed it. For weeks, I had been reacting to their behavior. Now we were the ones taking action and demanding compliance. 3 days later, Isabel called with an update. The fraud investigation showed a clear pattern. Years of transfers from Dad's benefits account to Mom and David's joint account. She flagged the transactions as suspicious and created a timeline. But she said we still needed more evidence to prove the transfers were illegal. We needed VA documents showing Dad never approved Mom as his representative payee. We might need court orders for additional account access. She said the bank was continuing its investigation, but it would take time. I wrote down every detail. Each piece of information felt like another step toward the truth. That same week, the VA scheduled an interview with Dad. Victor Hall said they were evaluating his representative payee arrangement. To ensure Dad's wishes were clear, they would interview him alone. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Victor said this was standard when payee authority was under review. They needed to know what Dad wanted and whom he trusted with his benefits. For the first time in weeks, I felt real hope. Someone was prioritizing Dad's voice. I helped him practice answering interview questions despite his nerves. 3 days later, Lucas Gray called again. He said he visited Mom and David's home for the APS investigation. They cooperated fully and claimed to have power of attorney over Dad's medical and financial decisions. Lucas said they had documents ready and explanations prepared, but he needed copies to verify authenticity. He explained that financial abusers often have paperwork that looks legitimate. His job was to confirm whether their authority was valid. He said he would update me as the investigation continued. After I hung up, frustration hit. Of course they were prepared. They had kept the lie going for a decade. The next week, Elena obtained copies of the supposed power of attorney through discovery. She called me to her office and spread the document out. It showed Dad granting Mom power over his affairs, but even I noticed something off. The signature was shaky and inconsistent. Compared with Dad's signatures on VA documents and our recent forms, it didn't match. The date was from 13 years ago, during Dad's hospitalization. Elena pointed out more issues: a faded notary seal and witness signatures that were barely visible. She said we might need a handwriting expert, but even without one, the document looked questionable. The next morning, Dad and I went to the DMV to get him a state ID. Because we were staying at a hotel, Victor helped us obtain a Vapo box to use as our mailing address. We completed the forms, and Dad presented his discharge papers and Social Security card for verification. The clerk processed everything and said the ID would be ready in 20 minutes. We waited in plastic chairs. When they called his name, Dad walked to the counter and received a temporary paper ID with his photo. He looked at it carefully. His name, his first address in a decade. Not a hospital, not my parents' home. Our address. He folded it neatly and placed it in his wallet. It was just a paper card, but it felt like a small victory in a situation where we were still behind. Back at the hotel, Victor called again. He asked if I had time to go over the VA Caregiver Program application. I agreed immediately. Over the phone, he explained which medical documents we needed from Palmer and which forms required a doctor's signature. The application asked for details about Dad's daily needs, disabilities, and treatment. I checked boxes for medication, appointments, meal preparation, and emotional support. Each question reminded me how much responsibility had shifted onto me. Victor also connected me with training materials. That night, I completed the first session, which focused on veteran mental health and caregiver stress. The program emphasized boundaries and reaching out for support, concepts that felt foreign to me at 20, unsure of what I was doing. Victor confirmed he received my application through the VA portal and said approval could take several weeks, but he would monitor the process. 3 days later, I had my first appointment with Amelia Fletcher at the community mental health clinic where the shelter counselor had referred me. The waiting area was a converted house with mismatched furniture and motivational posters. When she called me back, I followed her into a small office with a subtle lavender scent. She was around 40, wore glasses, and had a calm presence that made the room feel safer. She asked what brought me in, and I explained everything. Being forced out of my home, finding Dad, and discovering the stolen money. Halfway through, I noticed my hands were shaking and that I was speaking too quickly. She listened without interrupting. She asked about my sleep and eating habits when I finished, and I admitted both were poor. She said we would work on coping strategies and trauma processing at a steady pace. For now, she wanted me to have a space to talk. The session lasted of about 50 minutes, but leaving felt like setting down some of the weight I'd been carrying. The next week, I met with Isabel at the bank for a detailed interview. She printed every transaction from my old savings account for the past 5 years and marked them with sticky notes. She asked who authorized each withdrawal and transfer, what the money was used for, and whether I had given permission. I explained that Mom always said the money was for college, that I never had direct access, and that I didn't know she could close the account without telling me. Isabel then asked about my joint account. I told her Mom claimed it was normal for parents to be on their kids' accounts when I was 13. She documented everything and explained the bank's temporary credit rules in cases of fraud. Even though the account was shared, the withdrawal patterns and the timing of the final transfer right after I found out Dad was alive supported my claim. She said the bank's fraud review committee would evaluate the case and update me in 2 weeks. A few days later, Lucas called again to arrange a DNA test. He said we needed biological proof to counter any claims Mom and David made about my relationship to Dad. The APS file would store the test results. I agreed, even though it felt strange to have to prove something so basic. The next morning, a technician swabbed our cheeks at the lab and labeled the samples. The whole process took 10 minutes. As I walked out, frustration hit me again. It felt wrong that a decade of lies had forced me to prove I was my father's child. Dad stayed silent in the car, and I knew he felt the same. Later, Elena updated me at the legal aid office. She filed an emergency request for temporary control of certain accounts, arguing that Mom and David's continued access risked more asset loss. The motion asked the court to freeze the accounts and require financial reporting during the investigation. Our hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Elena laid out the paperwork and explained that court outcomes were unpredictable. Judges had broad discretion, and we might not get everything we asked for. Still, it was our strongest chance to prevent further damage while APS and law enforcement continued their work. I signed the verification forms, and she filed everything electronically. That afternoon, the funeral home sent more documents. 3 days later, I opened another envelope at the hotel. More invoices and contracts for the memorial service. Nothing about the arrangement included cremation, burial, or handling of remains. Just a rented room, chairs, and a guest book. I stared at the documents, trying to process that I remembered a funeral and viewed a coffin I had wept over. The entire thing had been staged. In a VA hospital, only 20 meters away, my mother and David held a memorial service for a man who was still alive. Something inside me fractured. A cold anger spread through me, my hands shaking. After leaving the motel, I walked around the parking lot and nearby streets for almost an hour until my legs hurt and the anger faded. Victor Hall submitted Dad's HUD-VASH screening. Given his service record and current condition, Dad was eligible for housing vouchers and case management for homeless veterans. The VA clinic interview was scheduled for the next Tuesday. When Victor explained the process, Dad became anxious that they might think he was either too unstable or not in need of help. That night, I sat with him and practiced responses to the questions Victor expected. I reminded him that he had served his country, earned this support, and that being honest about what he needed didn't make him weak. We rehearsed until he could discuss his mental health and housing situation without shaking. The legal assistance office received an email from Mom's personal account. Elena forwarded it to me and asked me to call. I read the message, a long, wandering explanation about fear, confusion, and how she supposedly planned to tell me the truth when I was older. She blamed everything on being afraid of losing Dad and claimed she never meant to hurt anyone. It went on for pages without taking responsibility or offering a genuine apology. When Elena and I spoke later that afternoon, she confirmed it was a textbook non-apology, acknowledging nothing, taking no blame. She had already informed Mom that all future communication must go through attorneys. It was reassuring knowing there was a barrier between us, so Mom couldn't manipulate me. Elena suggested we might hire a handwriting expert to evaluate the strength of the attorney signatures. She said specialists cost several $1,000s and recommended waiting to see whether the bank's internal review detected anything suspicious. If their analysts flagged the documents, we'd gain strong leverage without spending money. I wanted immediate answers, but I was starting to understand that legal strategy often meant waiting for the other party to slip up, not fighting every issue at once. She assured me she'd continue pushing on multiple fronts and that we'd decide about the expert after the bank's assessment. Dad and I established a daily routine to keep from Spire. I sorted his medications into a pill organizer, and we took them together with breakfast each morning. Then, we spent an hour handling paperwork, calls, agencies, documents, and emails. After that, we walked around the hotel parking lot for 10 to 15 minutes. Having structure made us feel less overwhelmed. Dad's anxiety eased when he had a clear plan instead of reacting to constant emergencies. Some days, I wanted everything resolved faster because the routine felt slow. But I was learning that real stability comes from steady habits, not sudden breakthroughs. On Thursday morning, while I was arranging Dad's pills, Giovanni called. APS's preliminary review confirmed our concerns about financial exploitation and justified a deeper investigation. More importantly, it validated everything we had been reporting. He reminded me this wasn't a final ruling, but said it gave Detective Hugo Larkin a strong foundation for the criminal case. The official abuse record would support both the criminal investigation and the civil claims. After weeks of feeling unsure, hearing an official confirm it had actually happened left me stunned. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the pill organizer, knowing Mom and David had committed real harm backed by documents. 2 hours later, Isabel Stone from the bank called. Their analysis indicated that the power of attorney signature might be forged when compared with Dad's other records. They were suspending Dad's benefit withdrawals during the investigation. We didn't get any money back yet, but this prevented Mom and David from taking more while we built the case. She estimated the review would take another couple of weeks. Progress was slow, but the holds were immediate and enforceable. Dad asked what was happening, and I explained both calls. I watched his expression shift from confusion to a kind of cautious hope. that maybe the system sometimes worked, instead of always failing vulnerable people. Later that week, we met Elena Carter in the courthouse lobby, 30 minutes early, to go over the restraining order hearing scheduled for Monday. She said the judge would hear both sides, review the police report documenting David entering our parking lot, and decide whether to issue the order. Dad's leg bounced as we went through security and waited outside the courtroom. David arrived with an attorney in a cheap suit. My stomach dropped. Part of me hoped he wouldn't show and the order would go uncontested. Instead, he appeared defensive and confrontational. When the bailiff called our case, we entered, us with Elena and David with his lawyer. The judge allowed David's attorney to speak first. He claimed David never threatened us, was only checking on family after a difficult situation, and argued that we were overreacting. Elena responded by outlining the police report, the pattern of harassment, and David showing up right after we began legal action. The judge examined the report for what felt like forever. Then I asked David directly whether he had any legitimate reason to be in our parking lot at night. David began talking about family obligations, but the judge cut him off. Based on the intimidation evidence, the court issued a limited restraining order requiring him to stay 500 feet away from us for 6 months. We walked out, and I felt both relieved and disappointed. 6 months felt protective, yet still short. Elena reminded us it was a solid outcome and that any violation would lead to jail time. We drove to Palmer on Wednesday for Dad's VA representative payee evaluation. A social worker took him into an office alone while I waited for 40 minutes, refreshing my phone constantly. When Dad came out, he looked worn out, but okay. They asked who should manage his benefits, and he immediately named me. The social worker called afterward and explained that I needed to complete training modules and submit documents, but Dad's clear preference mattered. She handed me a training packet and said they'd contact me with next steps, all due within a month. Dad stayed quiet in the car, admitting he was afraid I might feel overwhelmed and leave. I reassured him I wouldn't, but I could tell he still doubted it. On Thursday afternoon, Victor Hall called to say Dad passed the HUD-VASH eligibility screening and we could start looking for an apartment. He connected me with Osto Carney, the housing coordinator, who explained the voucher covered most of the rent and that we needed a one-bedroom that met program standards. Osto said he'd send listings and arrange viewings. I told Dad we were getting real housing instead of short-term hotel vouchers. When I explained the cost, he went quiet, and tears rolled down his face. I sat with him until he calmed. Friday, I updated Dad's mailing address across every agency: Social Security, VA, bank, pharmacy, and insurance. Each office had its own form and verification process. Victor advised using a VAPO box as our temporary mailing address until permanent housing was secured. Each submission felt like reclaiming control, cutting off Mom and David's access to Dad's records. My hands cramped from typing and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. But this kind of steady administrative work protected him more effectively than confrontation. On Monday, Isabel Stone from the bank called to say they were issuing a small temporary credit into a new student account she helped me open, completely separate from my parents. She emphasized it was only a portion of what was taken and could be reversed if their investigation didn't support our claims. The money arrived Tuesday. I stared at the deposit for a minute, knowing it was mine and secure. I used some of it for groceries instead of relying on hotel vouchers. Dad and I cooked dinner together in the kitchenette. On Wednesday, Someone claiming to be Mom's cousin posted on social media insisting the family needed to meet before things got worse. I reread it and recognized the manipulative framing. I wasn't escalating anything. They were the ones who mishandled Dad's finances for a decade. I sent the screenshot to Elena, who replied that we wouldn't meet without attorneys. It stung, knowing we couldn't trust Mom's side of the family to care about us. But sending that refusal felt empowering. Thursday, Elena called suggesting a settlement discussion before filing a full case, explaining that lawsuits were expensive and time-consuming, and a repayment agreement could be better than years of litigation. I doubted Mom and David would accept responsibility, but Elena said we should attempt settlement first, then proceed with a suit if needed. I agreed, though I wasn't optimistic. Friday, the DNA results arrived. I already knew the answer, but seeing it confirmed, 99.9%. Certainty that I was Dad's biological son eliminated any argument that I had no right to oversee his care. An hour later, Giovanni Gray called saying he'd received the results and was filing them with APS. I uploaded the report to our evidence folder and cloud backup, proof of something I never questioned but still had to verify. 3 days later, Victor Hall called while I made breakfast. The VA review of Dad's representative payee change was awaiting final approval and would be completed in about 3 weeks. In the meantime, holds were placed on the accounts to prevent unauthorized access. This meant Mom and David couldn't touch anything. After I relayed this to Dad, his hands shook until I held them steady. The settlement meeting took place the following Tuesday in a small conference room with flickering lights. Elena sat beside me with her laptop and 3 folders. Mom arrived first with her attorney, eyes red and swollen, and immediately tried to hug me. I waited for her to sit down. David came 10 minutes late without legal counsel, claiming the entire situation was a misunderstanding and that we were damaging his reputation at work. Elena ignored him and presented bank statements showing Dad's benefits deposited into their joint account. Mom's attorney shifted in his chair, taking notes. Elena reviewed each document methodically, highlighting dates, amounts, and the timeline of Dad's hospitalization and transfers. Mom kept interrupting to explain her confusion and the stress of losing her husband. David insisted everything was legal under power of attorney, until Elena placed the questioned signature next to Dad's verified signatures. The room fell silent, except for the buzzing overhead lights. Watching Mom cry and David switch between anger and excuses left me drained rather than angry. I was ready to move on with Dad. After 2 hours, Mom's attorney proposed a repayment plan. Elena outlined exact terms. We agreed Mom and David would reimburse the stolen funds over time, based on investigative findings. It wasn't everything we were owed, and there was no admission of wrongdoing. What Elena said, it created a legal foundation and allowed further action if they failed to comply. I signed where needed and left without looking at Mom, who cried harder when she realized I wasn't forgiving her. 2 days later, we returned for the asset freeze hearing. The judge reviewed Elena's request and asked Mom's attorney if he opposed a limited freeze on the disputed accounts. He tried to argue hardship, but the judge cut him off, stating the evidence showed a risk of asset dissipation. The freeze prevented Mom and David from moving or hiding money during investigations. It wasn't dramatic, but it was protection. When Dad asked if we won, I told him we got what we needed. That afternoon, Osto contacted us about a one-bedroom HUD-VASH unit near bus routes and the VA. We had a viewing the next morning. I barely slept, afraid something would fall through. The apartment was on the second floor of a modest brick building with a small parking lot. Inside, the appliances worked, the walls were clean, the bedroom had natural light, and the bathroom had strong water pressure. Standing in the empty living room, my chest finally loosened after months. Dad checked each wall twice, as if making sure it was real. Osto said we could move in after the paperwork processed in 2 weeks. I signed the application. That night, the VA Caregiver Program emailed an acceptance letter pending completion of training modules. I opened the link and began learning about medication management, mobility support, and identifying distress signals. After finishing the 3-day training, I'd receive a small monthly stipend for helping Dad with daily tasks and appointments. It wasn't much, but it was steady income and recognition that caregiving is work, not something automatically owed because of family ties. The following week, Giovanni Gray called saying APS issued Mom and David a preliminary letter of concern, confirming financial abuse of a disabled veteran. It wasn't a final ruling, but strengthened both criminal and civil cases. I asked what came next, and he explained the district attorney would review the report and decide whether to file charges. We moved in on Saturday morning. Dad and I took the bus, carrying our belongings in trash bags. Osto helped us bring the bags upstairs before leaving us alone. Dad shuffled between the living room and bedroom, asking, what if the VA changes their mind? What if we can't afford it? What if Mom and David find us? His breathing sped up, so I guided him to the couch and used Amelia Fletcher's breathing exercises. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, until his shaking eased. We unpacked slowly, arranging donated dishes and hanging his few clothes to make the space feel like home. On Monday, I received an update from Agatha Stone at the bank. Their internal fraud findings allowed a larger temporary credit to my protected account, covering a significant portion of the college savings taken. It was still provisional, but seeing the balance felt like coming up for air. I checked it several times to be sure. The next week, Dad began therapy with Dr. Victor Montes, a VA psychiatrist specializing in trauma. I waited in the lobby with old magazines. Dad came out an hour later, worn but calmer. He said Victor was honest about the difficult work ahead, acknowledging both military trauma and the psychological impact of 10 years of unnecessary hospitalization, but also optimistic about Dad's progress. For the first time in a long time, we felt hopeful. A week later, I visited the community college and found Cassie Vickers' office. She was younger than expected, with a desk full of forms and a deadline survivor mug. I told her I was 20, caring for my injured veteran father and trying to start school. She opened the fee waiver program, listed requirements, and asked about my high school transcripts. I said I could request them from my old address. She then showed me a typical first semester plan for someone balancing work and caregiving, suggested 2 online classes with flexible deadlines, and explained how disability services could help if Dad had a crisis. She didn't judge me for starting late or taking a lighter course load, and I felt less tense. She submitted my fee waiver, and I left with a schedule and a campus map marked with the financial aid office. 3 days later, while sorting Dad's weekly medications, Elena called. Mom's attorney proposed selling one of their cars to make the first repayment, a gesture she valued at around $8,000. It fulfilled part of the settlement. I clenched my jaw. It felt more like obligation than remorse. Elena clarified that the funds would go directly into the restitution escrow and that they had 30 days to provide proof of sale and deposit. When I asked whether they were taking responsibility, she said they were complying to avoid further legal action, not out of regret. After hanging up, I explained it to Dad. He didn't care why, only that they were returning the money. 2 weeks later, I saw David's truck in our parking lot while carrying groceries. My stomach dropped. He sat in the driver's seat staring at our building. I walked back to the street and called 911, giving them his license plate and our address. The dispatcher kept me on the line and told me to stay safe. From the nearby bus stop, I watched the police arrive. After a short conversation, they detained David. I showed an officer the restraining order on my phone. He confirmed David was being arrested and that I'd receive a court date. In court the next week, David claimed he was just driving through. The prosecutor presented the police report, GPS data confirming my location, and photos of his truck in our lot. The judge called it a clear violation and extended the restraining order to a full year, warning that any further violations would result in jail until trial. For the first time, it felt like the system prioritized our safety. Elena sent back a thumbs up and a single word, good. Thursday arrived with a thick VA envelope. I reread the first paragraph several times. My representative payee status was officially approved. I now had full authority to manage Dad's benefits. The letter included transition steps, contact numbers, and a checklist. Holding it, I understood the responsibility. After years of misuse, I was finally trusted to manage what Dad earned. I showed him the letter as he watched the news. He read it, looked up, and said thank you, eyes wet. My first caregiver stipend arrived on the 15th. I saw the deposit notification during one of Dad's medical appointments. It was only a few $100s, but steady income. Combined with Dad's benefits, which I now oversaw, we could afford rent and food without constant fear. Dad touched my shoulder when I showed him the message. On the way home, I bought fresh vegetables instead of packaged meals.